The year was 1774, and King George III sat in his palace, the weight of rebellion pressing heavier with each new report from the colonies. First came word of the Boston Massacre, a bloodstain on British authority. Then, the Boston Tea Party, a brazen act of defiance where rebellious colonists, disguised as warriors, dumped an entire shipment of tea into the freezing harbor. To King George, this wasn't just disobedience. It was a declaration of war against the empire itself. Enraged, he declared, "This insolence cannot stand." The answer: the Intolerable Acts. Boston's port was slammed shut, its lifeline cut off. Colonial governments were shackled, and British troops were given unchecked power to crush any flicker of rebellion. The laws were meant to break Boston's spirit, to bring the colonies groveling back to the crown. But instead of surrender, the colonies answered with unity and defiance. What King George believed would extinguish the flames of rebellion.
How can this be? You won't get away with this!
Only fanned them into an inferno, a fire that would soon engulf an empire.
Let's go back to King George's reaction to the Boston Tea Party and the beginning of the Intolerable Acts of 1774. Alright, so we're now in early 1774, and word finally reaches England about the chaos unfolding in Boston. King George hears about the destruction in Boston Harbor, along with the ongoing violence against his officials, and let's just say he is not amused. He's sitting there thinking, I fought a whole war to protect these colonies, rid them of the French, and borrowed massive sums to do it, with British taxpayers footing the bill. And how do they repay me? With protests, violence, and dumping loads of tea in the harbor? Imagine for a moment if today a state just up and decided it didn't like a certain tax, started assaulting postal workers, and destroyed federal property. It's a serious level of rebellion. So, in King George's mind, Boston's protesters are something like outlaws or even terrorists. And honestly, he isn't wrong to think that Boston is at the heart of it all. From the Boston Massacre to aggressive protests after every new tax and duty, Boston has been a constant thorn in his side. To him, the people of Boston have turned into spoiled brats who, every time they don't get their way, throw a temper tantrum and make life difficult for everyone, and so King George decides it's time for serious consequences. A make an example out of them moment. He's ready to lay down the law to show the other colonies what happens when you mess with the crown. This brings us to the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists would come to call the Intolerable Acts. Up until now, King George had mostly left the handling of the colonies to Parliament, but not anymore. He's now directly involved, telling Parliament, "You're not doing enough, it's time we set things straight." So here's the rundown on these coercive acts, which were essentially 4 harsh measures aimed squarely at punishing Boston. Closing Boston Harbor. Boston's port is shut down to all trade until the tea destroyed during the Boston Tea Party is paid for. And it's not just the big port itself that's closed. There are British warships set up at its mouth, making sure that no ships can sneak in or out. For Bostonians, this is a massive blow because without trade, their economy is going to be seriously hurting. Quartering Act. British troops are sent back into Boston to maintain order, and this time locals are required to house these soldiers. So you've got redcoats back in town, right where the Boston Massacre happened, and now they're staying in people's homes. It's like adding fuel to an already blazing fire. Massachusetts Government Act. Boston had a lively town meeting culture, which was how they organized their protests and resistance. This act effectively bans town meetings unless explicitly approved by the governor, meaning that Bostonians can't freely gather and strategize against the British. Administration of Justice Act. British officials accused of crimes in the colonies would now be sent back to Britain for trial. The colonists saw this as a free pass for British officials to act however they pleased without facing consequences. To King George, this all seems perfectly fair. He's thinking, behave, or this is what happens. The colonies, however, see it differently. As word of these intolerable acts spreads, a sense of unity starts to form across the colonies. Other colonies see Boston's punishment as a warning shot aimed at them too. If the British Crown can just shut down an entire port, force citizens to quarter troops, and crack down on local governance, well, what's stopping them from doing the same elsewhere? And so, instead of frightening the colonies into submission, the intolerable acts actually push them closer together. A new phrase starts to echo across the colonies. An injury to one is an injury to all. What King George intended as a show of force to quell rebellion is now fanning the flames of what will become a full-blown revolution. The intolerable acts have now hit hard, with the British government fully clamping down on Massachusetts. Let's recap the new rules here. Boston Harbor is shut down. No trade until the British East India Company is reimbursed for all that lost tea. No town hall meetings without a British official present, and none in Massachusetts at all. British soldiers are stationed back in Boston to maintain order. The General Court of Massachusetts is effectively dissolved, with the British appointed governor now wielding all the power over the colony's laws, taxes, and infrastructure. The impact of these moves is staggering. If you're a merchant in Boston, your livelihood just tanked. You can't easily switch to another port without a major loss in profits, and many tradespeople and dock workers are staring down financial ruin. Meanwhile, British soldiers back in Boston feel like an invasion of your own city. And now, instead of self-government, it's military rule and a royal governor making all the decisions. So, what's the colonists' take on this? They're furious. This hits especially hard for people inspired by Enlightenment ideas who already feel uneasy about unchecked authority. The concept of a monarch or his representatives having absolute power over the colony flies in the face of what they believe is fair and just governance. This outrage is reflected in political cartoons of the time. One famous piece shows Lady Liberty, dressed in a Native American headdress symbolizing freedom, being force-fed tea by a British officer. It's dark and visceral, implying that the British are violating colonial freedom itself, almost as though they're holding Lady Liberty hostage. The unrest isn't confined to Boston or even Massachusetts. The colonies are now connected by a shared anger and a real fear that what's happening in Boston could happen to them next. For many of these colonies, this is the moment they start to see their fates as intertwined. So what happens next? Colonial leaders start reaching out to each other, realizing they need to band together. It's almost like a network of alliances forming, with elites from each colony writing letters, sending messengers, and spreading the word about what's happening. You can almost picture the conversations. "Hey, Steve in North Carolina, it's Joe in Virginia. You heard about Boston? It's getting out of control, man. If the king can take over their government, what's stopping him from doing the same to ours?" These discussions are leading up to a major decision. It's time for a united response, and so, in 1774, the colonies plan to convene their first Continental Congress, a gathering of colonial representatives to discuss this new crisis. It's an unprecedented move, and it'll bring delegates from across the colonies to Philadelphia. They aren't yet talking about independence, but they're meeting to figure out how to stand against these new British impositions. So, we're in 1774, and colonial leaders, wealthy, influential figures from across the colonies, meet in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They're gathering to figure out how to respond to the harsh measures Britain has imposed on Massachusetts. This is an assembly of merchants, lawyers, landowners, some colonial assembly members, and prominent voices in the colonies. Think of it as a powerful mix of early American influencers, like George Washington from Virginia, who was a war veteran from the 7 Years' War, and other notable figures from New England and beyond. When these guys get to Philadelphia, the opinions on how to respond are split. Some are so angered by the treatment of Massachusetts that they're already talking about taking up arms and pushing for independence, but at this point, most attendees think that's extreme. Instead, the general consensus is to use the same tactic that worked before: economic pressure. Key actions of the First Continental Congress: boycott British goods. They decide on a total boycott of British goods, encouraging colonies to stop buying British imports and exporting American goods to Britain. It's a familiar strategy they'd tried before, and they believe it could force Britain to reconsider. Send a strongly worded letter to King George. They draft a petition that spells out their grievances and demands. It's a formal letter that argues the colonists' rights to life, liberty, and property, and it condemns the coercive acts as oppressive. The letter essentially says, "King George, what you're doing to Massachusetts is unfair. We demand that you repeal these laws, remove the duty on tea, and let things return to the way they were in 1763. Plan to meet again in a year." Believing that King George will likely do as Parliament has done in the past, backing down and repealing oppressive laws, they decide to reconvene in a year. Many hope that by 1775 they'll be celebrating in Philadelphia, with tensions eased and colonial grievances addressed. With their plan set, they disperse. Delegates head back to their colonies, telling people to join the boycott and wait for the king's response. They feel certain that this will bring resolution, just as the Stamp Act protests did. But little do they know this time, the British response will be far different. What happens next? The letter makes its way across the Atlantic and lands on King George's desk. But instead of the expected concession, King George digs in his heels. He doesn't see the colonists as petitioners with legitimate concerns. He views them as rebellious subjects who need to be shown who's in charge. This dismissal will only intensify colonial unity and deepen the resolve of those who are increasingly ready to go beyond protests. The stage is set for a historic shift. As tensions simmer, the colonies brace for what will soon become a full-scale conflict. The clock is ticking toward revolution. Follow the rest of the story in part 4 of the America Begins series. Just look for this thumbnail right here.
In the dawn, suddenly light, our flags were sung with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the drumbeats in our hearts, we chased away the dark. Men of courage side by side, for freedom we would die. Hear the cannons roar, freedom's knocking at the door. Through the fire and the strife, we fight for a new life. Silent stars above our heads shelter us in night